Welcome back to the Manage to Win podcast. Today's episode is sponsored by Habitly.com. And in our podcast today, we're going to talk about habits. I'll get to that in a moment. But Habitly.com helps you take your strong habits, make them stronger, your weak habits, and address them and overcome them. And we have companies across the country that are using Habitly.com with their people, with their teams. You watch the lesson, you come away, and you say, okay, what do we learn from that? What can we do differently as a team? What can we do differently as individuals? And then there's some accountability moving forward. It's very productive. Check it out, Habitly.com. Today's episode is with Dr. Lauren Tucker. She's the founder and CEO of Do What Matters. Now, they are an inclusion management consultancy. So when you hear that, you think diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI type stuff, and that it may be combative or divisive. I have to tell you, this was a great conversation. Really big on how you should run your company better so people are fully engaged, which is my term. Her term is people are included or there's inclusiveness. Really enjoyed the conversation. I think there's a lot here for you. Let's dive in. Lauren, I'm really glad to have you on the show. You know, we haven't had anybody talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, okay? But it is a hot topic. As a matter of fact, for a client, I'm about to review a DEI course to be rolled out internally. But what do you see in your experience are the three primary barriers to greater diversity on a team?
Okay, well, thank you. First of all, thank you for having me. And when it comes to barriers, the first barrier is start by saying inclusion first, right? So we're inclusion first. We're an inclusion first management consultancy because we believe that inclusion is the input and should be the first input. If you do inclusion right, greater diversity and representation will follow. And we see those as outputs. So the first barrier is really a mindset change. Actually,
how do you define inclusion?
So inclusion is making sure that everyone feels safe, valued, heard, and productive. That's the first thing. And then inclusion management is making sure that everybody in the organization feels like they have a great job, they're doing great work, and that their relevant differences are elevated, that aren't just about targeted differences, black and brown and female, et cetera, but it's also about differences that might be of socioeconomic background, but it also might be differences in terms of making sure you've got the right people in the room. A lot of times, you know, especially when we talk to advertising agencies, the analytics people don't feel like they're in the room or included, or the accounting people or the finance people. So it's about getting great people doing great jobs, quality jobs, and elevating their relevant differences so that they can create products or services or content that is memorable, meaningful, and remarkable for a multicultural, transcultural, and global world. And we need to get our heads around that. So that's what inclusion is. That's what inclusion first is. That's what inclusion management is. And that's first a key mindset change. I would say.
You know, you go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to answer your other two barriers, right?
Oh, yeah. So, well, if you can keep those in mind, I just want to stay here because I have a tiny brain. So if I walk away, I'll forget. But it's interesting because the term inclusion, you know, I would typically say engagement. So, I mean, if I interchange those words, I think you and I and many others are saying very similar things.
Engagement.
Go ahead.
Engagement is a tricky word because I don't actually see them as the same thing.
Okay.
In fact, the global data on engagement reveals an evolution of the workforce, where the evolution is that I don't know if you're going to see higher engagement levels globally, because I think there's been a mindset shift that work now comes second after life. So Europeans typically have lower engagement levels and have consistently had lower engagement levels around 20, I want to say 25, 30% according to Gallup. Don't quote me on those numbers, but it's in the 20s. In the United States, those numbers are in the 30s. I think in the United States, we typically have had a history of careerism, putting work first versus life. I think after COVID, we're going to start to see, we're already seeing that shift of putting life before work. So I think engagement in work globally is shifting. I think the metric of engagement is tricky. And we as a company, as consultants, focus much more on employee NPS scores, which I think tell a better tale about how people feel about their place of employment and the job that they're doing. And typically we look at, would you be willing to recommend this place as a great place to work, as a great work experience? And we're finding that is much more predictive of reduction in churn, much more predictive of better inclusion experiences. So we engagement is a tricky metric that we're not as bought into as a lot of people are.
It's interesting because we're using different verbiage, but it seems like there's a lot of commonality on the objective. The numbers that I remember from Gallup are that 82% were not fully engaged at work. And you're saying that those numbers might get worse. I don't see how they can get much worse, although, as fractured as the country is becoming, it certainly is possible, sadly. But and also it's interesting what you brought up about people more focused on their personal lives than work. And as a leader, and the leaders that I work with, we're trying to do a lot of the things you just mentioned, making people feel safe, making them feel valued, making it so they would definitely recommend someone else come and work there, and staying engaged with them to make that happen. So I actually see a lot of commonality. We might use some different verbiage, but it's interesting to me. So forgive me for interrupting and going down that path, but just wanted to check in. So what would be the next two barriers for?
Yeah, so I think that it's interesting. This will be a good segue, and I will say another barrier is getting the metrics right. There are too many people that are focused on, what I call the census data in terms of measuring diversity. How many Black people do we have? What levels do we have them in? How many white people do we have? How many Asian people do we have? How many women do we have? That to me is the wrong metric. Those are outputs of doing the right thing. Those are not the inputs. And there's such a myopic focus on those numbers that we're missing the deeper aspects of employee experience. So when we think of inclusion first, we start by understanding, and don't get me wrong, engagement is important. Engagement is important. We measure engagement across the culture, but we also measure vertically. We have partners that help us measure what we call vertically the depth of inclusion experience. And what we're finding is that whether whether it's Black and brown people or women, they signal they're the ones most affected by a toxic culture, but they are also signaling that the culture itself is not working, or the system is broken. And so we often come in because people have these quote unquote DEI initiatives, but standalone DEI initiatives will not fix a broken system. And we typically will find when we do our analysis and our initial assessment that what Black and brown people or women feel most acutely is something that a larger, typically majority of employees are feeling in terms of the system, the talent management system, not working to create a place where they all feel they can have great work experiences and great careers. So how we measure is important, but it is again, it's a mindset change, and it is a challenging thing to get people from going straight to things like the Rooney Rule. Well, we got to get our metrics in every quarter. We got to see that we're making sure we're hiring more Black people and hiring more brown people, and it becomes it just becomes a kind of a gamification of metrics, and it's not getting at what's really happening. And I'll give you an example. When I started my career in advertising at Leo Burnett, I remember the managing director of my group, he onboarded me, and I later found out he onboarded everybody because that was part of the culture there, was to onboard everybody by saying, hey, Lauren, we like to give everybody, all of our people, enough rope to hang themselves. And it's interesting when I tell that story, of course, now people are just horrified because there's a hanging reference, there's a lynching reference, there's a suicide reference. And what I tell them is, I appreciate the fact that you are challenged by that imagery, but what we should really be focusing on is what that managing director is really saying to all of the early career people that they're recruiting, and that is, I have all the power, but I'm abdicating the responsibility for helping you achieve job success. And that should concern us even more, because that's what he was really saying, was that, yeah, we're going to hire you in here and then we're going to throw you into the deep end, and hey, whatever happens to you happens to you. And that's that late 20th century, what I call talent abuse. I mean, we were all, those of us who came of professional age in the late 20th century, we were all raised by wolves. And that is just not going to stand any longer, right? But what was interesting to me was a young woman who told me, it was really her mother, her very proud but worried mother, when a managing director of one of the big consulting firms, how they hire people in cohorts, right? Like 100 young people, early career people. And it was a big onboarding event. And he stood up in front of them and he said, I want you to look around, because out of the 100 of you, only 20 will be here by the end of the year. That's saying the same thing. It's saying, I'm abdicating responsibility. I'm going to have all this power, but I'm abdicating responsibility to help you with job success. Of course, I read that as, you are really poor at hiring people if 80% of the people you hire churn out by the end of the year. So I would suggest
hiring may be part of it, but it may not be a problem with the hiring. Like you're saying, it's a problem with the management. The other phrase I hear that's similar is, I manage with a long leash, and I hate that phrase. What that basically means is you're not managing. Right. You're putting people in the role and you're walking away. So it kind of goes back to your first barrier also about this inclusion, that they're not feeling valued as a member of the team. They're not getting the support they need. They're not on a career path. And like those big consulting firms, they hire 100 of them and they just grind them.
Right.
Yeah, they just grind them up. They overwork them. And, they're just like, hey, it's okay. It's the model. We're going to just grind them. We're going to charge full pop to the clients. And, when they leave, they leave. We'll get the next batch in because we're so good. They're going to want to come to work for us. But it's actually a terrible, toxic work environment often.
It's a terrible, toxic work environment. And, so many, and what's ironic, of course, is that I would say almost every one of the big 5 consulting firms puts out a lot of thought leadership on how important inclusion is and how important diversity is, et cetera. But those practices, and this is why we focus on the processes instead of individual trainings, right? We focus on processes. And then the training that we do focus on is securing that mindset change. and making sure that managers, and the C-suite understands that there is great responsibility, right? Spider-Man, right? Great responsibility that comes with that power, and that they need to reskill themselves to understand that they now have to actually action on that responsibility and not just talk about it in the press.
So you got these processes that you're implementing, and how do you train and test to make certain they're not just nodding their head and then you finish your consulting engagement and then they don't really implement it at all or very well?
Well, what we do is we train them and we give them a playbook, and then we provide hours of consulting to either help them implement or oversee or have them check in with us at various intervals. And then we make sure that their metric system, that they're measuring the right things, right, to measure the impact of those changes. And much of the impact of the changes comes through the what we call the inclusive talent hiring and interviewing process, right? Where, what we say is, this isn't just about inclusion, equity, and diversity. This is about a more efficient talent management program. And if you implement more inclusive measures, you will actually find that you hire better, you hire faster, and you end up with less churn. So a lot of the metrics that we measure are the metrics that should be measured in terms of talent management to begin with. And when leaders see improvements there, they start taking the entire project much more seriously, and they stop seeing these initiatives as bolt-on. They start to see it as integrated with the way they run their business, which is the way it should be.
Yeah, well, I think really the key is I'm fully in agreement with, what you're doing on the inclusive side. I love the fact that you're take your eye off the metrics side, where you're trying to fill seats based on certain heritages or genders or whatever it might be. I'm very interested in what your third barrier is that you think is there. But, on the hiring side, where you said it can go faster when you're really clear on what you're doing and you're doing the inclusive side of it. I teach my clients, I say, what's the most important thing when you're hiring? What's your number one objective? And most of them will say, well, to find a right fit, or find the best person, which is logical. But I tell them, no, your number one objective is to save time. Save your time and save the candidate's time. So you need to have a process that identifies early on whether this person's a fit or not. Cultural fit first. Secondly, hard skill experience fit. So that you can save them time, also save yourself time. Because why invest 2 hours, 3 hours or more interviewing, or multiple people interviewing? It might be 8 hours or 10 hours or 20 hours, depending on your process. And then hire the person they don't work out because you really didn't ask the hard questions or kind of walk through the paces initially. So I'm totally in agreement with you.
Yeah, what we do is we use a team-based process for interviewing and hiring. And that makes sure that everybody checks each other's biases, right? As individuals, we make really bad decisions. We do. We just make really bad decisions. And yet we have this legacy of process of hiring that allows cronyism. And that's what we talk about, right? It's an operational inefficiency that allows cronyism to play a much greater role in hiring decisions than it should, which creates conditions where you make poor hiring decisions, right? I could sit there and interview you and say, well, we just finished talking for 45 minutes about how we both love kayaking. And then the next person, so I love you. And then you go into the next person's office, which of course is a string of time, right? That is, scheduling and making sure that you're there or whatever. But now, somebody else talks to you and they realize you haven't shown that there's any way that really know what's required in this job. And so then we all, instead of getting back together and discussing our perspectives, we send each other emails going, I love David. He was great. Oh, let's hire him, and then another talent partner gets another thing. And so it ends up that if we do hire, it ends up that we've hired this guy that likes kayaking, but hasn't really shown that any performance indications that he can do the job. And so we talk about team-based hiring. We focus on performance-based evaluations. We make things very transparent and very explicit. But the true benefit of team-based hiring is that team becomes the advocacy team for that person. So we have a range of people on that team that are now vested in that person's success. And that person doesn't just have one person to go to. That person has 5 or 6 people to go to. And with that immediate credibility boost comes an increased probability of job success. So not only do we cut down the time that it takes to hire people, we make sure that they have the highest probability of job success by end of year 1. And that to me should be central. And what I typically do when I start an engagement, I talk to the CEO and I ask them the question, what is your number 1 priority? They always say growth. And I always say wrong. It's talent. Talent is going to be the engine of your growth. If you take care of your talent, growth will follow.
Well, and that goes back to what you said, the first barriers, inclusiveness, and how you talked about how making everybody feel valued, a member of the team, efficient, effective, et cetera. And then the second one is if you're looking at metrics of, what heritage or gender people are per role, it's the wrong metric. And then, so what's the third barrier to diversity on teams?
The third barrier is the toughest one, and that is getting the C-suite, in particular, the CEO, the COO, the general counsel, and typically the chief people officer is in the right headspace. But to get the others to realize that they will set the die, they will cast the die, they will set the tone for the entire project, that they have to reskill themselves and have a much different relationship with talent than when they came of professional age. Because we're talking about people who generally came of professional age in the late 20th century, early 21st century. Again, still legacy of machine age talent abuse. Now we're managing a talent force that we need their uniquely human capabilities to drive growth. And that requires that we pay much more attention to how we engage talent, how we nurture talent, how we advance talent. We need to treat them as the humans they are. And that needs to be a priority of the C-suite. That is probably the biggest challenge that we have, is getting that they talk a good game, but getting the C-suite to walk the walk and to really integrate the management of humans into the organizational strategy of the business is it's a big challenge until typically they have an egregious incident and then they realize with loss of customers or loss of revenue, maybe we do need to do something to reskill ourselves, to be in that learning, in that constant learning and development phase in the C-suite is a critical requirement for succeeding in the 21st century.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think that's tough because they get not only stuck in some bad habits and conscious and unconscious bias of different things, but also they just have so many tasks and so many requests on their time. And actually had a guy on the podcast recently, Brad, I believe is his name, and just recently, and he reminded the audience something probably you agree with, and something I remembered from reading Lee Iacocca's biography of Turning Around Chrysler years ago, that spending 2 hours a week of thinking strategy and what are truly my priorities can give a C-suite person time to reflect and to slow down and not look at email and not get interrupted by text, and just, okay, if talent's really my priority, what am I going to do different? And then holding themselves accountable to that week by week. This is what I said I'm going to do different. What did I do this week to kind of live that out? And I think a lot of people just don't realize that they have to kind of stop everything to have that time of reflection and self-accountability. Otherwise, they're just running. They're running by habit.
Yep. And I think, one of them is one of the things is recognizing best practices in terms of management scope right from the top. When I first started with the Richards Group, which is now TRG, and they've had a tremendous transformation, not only incredibly, it increased engagement scores, but their employee NPS scores went from a -10 to a +35,
Wow.
because they did implement so many of the things that we've recommended in terms of talent management. But when we first started working with them, the CEO, which had to step down because, again, of an egregious incident, Stan Richards, the owner as well, and he had 75 reports.
Wow.
I mean, that's just crazy, right?
Yeah. Well, it doesn't work.
It doesn't work. And it's an extreme version of what I believe still happens today. And that is CEOs have to learn how to distribute power and distribute responsibility. But they also have to really understand those 5, 6, 7 people maximum, right, in their C-suite, in their sphere, and make sure those people are managing the 5, 6, 7, limit to 7 people in their sphere. And there's a little too much of, micromanagement, right? I'm going to oversee 75 people. Or there is this kind of assuming that the rest of the C-suite does not need that CEO's direct intervention. And that's really the responsibility of the CEO, is to make sure that each one of those folks are feeling safe, valued, heard, productive, but that they're getting the learning and development in leadership and managing humans that they need to be better. And they need to model that behavior. And then that trickles down. But too many DEI initiatives, it's all about somehow it's going to trickle up. It's going to be individuals, contributors somehow participating in employee resource groups. And then that's going to be something else, and that's going to be something else. And somehow the organization is going to transform. It really will not transform unless the C-suite transforms itself.
So let me shift the conversation a little bit, because when we talk DEI, I'm in California. So DEI is big here, and it's often pretty nasty. The training and one of the statements you have in your backgrounder says that you're frustrated with progress on diversity, equity, and inclusion, left your position as chief strategy officer to promote a different approach to increasing diversity in an industry that is still more than 75% white. And a lot of the DEI stuff we get here in California is very much race against race, LGBT, whatever, against, people that have a different, more of a traditional belief. It's very battling. And what I'm hearing from you today is not that. It's like where I was hoping the conversation would be, and you did it just naturally, because that's what you're doing. So I applaud that. It's just like, you're like, hey, let's get together. Let's respect differences. And if I'm hearing you correctly, I don't know that you said this, but we don't have to agree with other people's conclusions or beliefs or whatever, but we can respect them. And how do we work together productively? So I love everything you've said, but where do we find common ground with people who want to focus more on dividing or want to look at those metrics on how many people, whether it's gender or race, we have in different roles or in the company. What do we do? I'm just interested in solutions and the best way to do something. What's your perspective?
So the bottom line is, my frustrations were that things haven't changed because we keep talking about DEI, and I am on a mission. My entire team is on an evangelical mission to get people to start talking about it as I, E, and D. And, because diversity first programs, while well-intentioned, do tend to create more resistance than it should, right? And it starts to make people, we need buy-in. We talk about creating customers for change. We need to create customers for change and eventually advocates for change. And we can't create customers for change by dealing with individual psychology and expecting us to change things at that individual level. So we focus on behavior-based processes that change the way that we manage talent and manage the work that talent does. The other thing that we do is we focus on, especially again, I've had many white men reach out to me and talk to me. I appreciate the fact that they feel comfortable talking to me about how, and we do a lot of work to make sure that they feel comfortable coming in and talking to us about how they feel that they're getting blamed or they feel that they're not being treated well. And so when we have those conversations, and they often talk about, well, I believe in equality. I don't believe in equity. I believe in equality. And I talk to them about, do you buy products from Amazon? and that shakes them. Like, what? And I said, do you buy products from Amazon? Well, they're like, yeah. Do you buy products online from, Walmart? Yeah. So are you okay with Amazon and Walmart basically giving you the same recommendations they give me? So, if I'm buying tampons, you're going to get a tampon recommendation. And they're like, whoa, wait a minute. What are you talking about? And I tell them that's equity. We call it personalization. We call it mass customization. In marketing, we have other words for it, right? But that's what equity is. And you know what? There's a white guy sitting next to you that has a different career aspiration, different career desires, expectations. You don't want to be treated in the same way that I'm treating you, that I'm treating him, because they have different needs, different requirements. So inclusion is about having those kinds of conversations. They should be solution building conversations. So we always start the question with, what we call our desired future assessment. We always start with, where do you want to go today? And that gets us out of this conversation about how we got lost, because you don't use a GPS to find out how you got lost. You use a GPS to figure out where you want to go. And then we can debate the ways of getting there, but we need to stop spending all of our time at the starting line debating about how we got lost. And too much initiatives spend time with everybody figuring out how we got lost and the basic psychology of wandering in the desert. That is not what we need to do. What we need to do is figure out where we want to go. And we got a lot more agreement on where we want to go than how we got lost.
Well, it strikes me. So I love the fact that you start with the inclusion, because another thing, which I don't know whether you've said, but if I don't get my own ship in order first, it doesn't matter the type of people that I bring in. They're going to be just as messed up as the way I've done this. And we talk about whether it's engagement or inclusion and how much people want to come to work. I teach it, basically my story real shortly is that in 2002, I had a .com go .bomb. And I realized I had leadership attributes, but no skills. And so I started studying leadership. And so I developed first a 12-step program for leaders addicted to poor management habits. I called it Success of People. It was too many things to remember, though. And over the years, I went to 7. And then for many years now, I've had 3 strands leadership. So cord of three strands not easily broken. So you have systematic power, which is a lot of what you talk about, process. You got to have the processes in place for the 4 management disciplines: how you hire, how you manage, how you develop, how you retain. Second piece is meaningful work, which I think you also spoke with. How do we get those people connected so they want to get up out of bed in the morning? They want to come to work. And then you brought up the value piece. The third strand that holds it all together is sincere gratitude. Notice I say sincere. Sincere gratitude. People know that you value them and you've got their back and you want to hear from them, even if they totally disagree with you. And so I love what you're saying. And
let me just interrupt you for a second.
Go ahead. Go.
Because it's interesting that you've written a book, and I will say I've probably now, because I'm writing my own book, and I would like to say I'm writing something different, but I'm not writing anything. I'm writing it from a different lens. But you've written the same book. I've written the same. I'm writing a book. I've got 30 other books of people that are saying we've got to manage humans better.
Yeah.
And what I see, and this is why that third barrier, that mindset change of the leadership of the C-suite is the biggest challenge, because with all of these books out there saying the same thing from different lenses, and I think we need those books and we need more of them, because I think it's got to be we got to hit some kind of critical mass where we really can transform not just the way that the C-suite thinks, but if you look at MBA programs, they're still teaching the legacy talent abusive techniques that, basically should have been left behind in the 20th century. So I don't know what it's going to take and how many more books we need to write. But I realized, I asked my own team, I said, should I write this book? Because I've got like 30 other books that are saying kind of the same thing. And my team, yeah, but nobody seems to be, there's not enough change happening in the C-suite. So these guys either are not reading, they're not listening to the podcast, they're not looking at the YouTube videos. So maybe we need 50 books, maybe we need 60 books. So that's why that third barrier is so difficult, because people like yourself have written several books saying the same thing. And we need the C-suite to start listening.
Well, let's go down this path for a moment, because I'm really interested in it. So, because I'm very concerned about our country. Sounds like you are too. And, I think one of the challenges we have is we have an educational system today that has lowered standards. So globally, we're falling. But like in California, we used to be like number 1 in education, and now we're like 49 out of 50 states. And it's, we're not teaching not only the core curriculum, reading, writing, arithmetic type of thing, but what we don't teach is soft skills. And a lot of what you're talking about is, can we teach people how to really be a good team player? Can we teach people how to be this leader? They're not learning it in school. They're not learning it from parents. Can we teach them how to run a meeting, how to get people involved, how to give sincere gratitude, how to have empathy, how to avoid conflict, how to resolve conflict? Think if we started teaching those skills like at 6th grade through 12th grade. And we had people coming out, whether or not they had some specific work skills also, but just with the soft skills side, how that would ultimately 10, 20, 30 years down the road radically change your C-suite. Because right now, what we're churning out is a lot of people via social media or whatever games are, quite frankly, very self-centered or narcissistic. And they just, hey, I'm a jerk, but that's just who I am, type of thing. Or, or they're so busy, they're performance oriented because they've got wounds. It's, I think that the problem at the C-suite actually starts many years before, and that's why it's so hard to unravel. It's so habit driven.
Well, I think one of the things, and it was funny because I did a speaking engagement about a month or so ago to a group of HR professionals at a company, and apparently the CEO had decided that I was supposed to do a second speaking engagement with the leadership of the company. But the CEO decided to sit in the back. And it was so funny because I was saying everything I was saying to you, and I completely agree with you about how education needs to change. And I said, still, the C-suite is still dominated by boomers and older Gen X and maybe slightly older, some older millennials. But I said it's still dominated by boomers. And he decided that he told the person who engaged me that he did not want to engage me for the management conversation because I was workers' rights and anti-boomer. And I laughed at my team and I said, but I am a boomer. I was like, I am a boomer. And so now I talk about being a recovering boomer because I do think, it's interesting. And I was just talking to my brother yesterday, a few days ago. My father, who was a World War II vet, and got his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania and was at the Federal Reserve Bank. I think he definitely felt like he had a successful career and a successful life, and that he was very driven not by careerism, but how his career supported his personal ambitions of spending time with his family and taking care of his kids and making sure his kids were happy and productive. And I was saying to my brother that I think many boomers whose parents were part of that greatest generation, who I think were largely driven by these personal goals of time with my family, making sure my kids are successful, making sure they're more successful than I am. We misinterpreted that as it's all about the career. I'm going to work hard because I'm going to get more houses, more boats, more this. It's all about me. Remember, we're the me generation, right? Boomers are the original me generation. And I think we've had that kind of self-involved, maybe selfish, but certainly self-involved. Remember the old greed is good. Remember the late 80s?
No, yeah.
Right. And so I think we're facing a reckoning now that we misinterpreted, I think, what our parents were trying to do in the 50s and 60s when they just wanted to give us the good life because they cared about us. And then we disconnected that from the motivation and just thought accumulation of things and, it's all about me and greed is good and my career is the only thing that counts. And we somehow forgot and disconnected it from being, to your point, humans that care about other humans, that are empathetic, that are helpful, that, care about what I like to call the commonwealth. And so when this guy, the CEO, heard me, he's a core boomer, misinterpreted the entire thing that I was trying to say. All he could say was, she's anti-boomer and she's workers' rights. And I'm just going, no, I'm a boomer myself who realizes we have to change our mindsets and we have to understand that there's a growing divide between management and talent in today's economy that we cannot afford. And we're going to have to figure out how to bridge that gap. And for us, inclusion management, we believe, is the critical strategy for not only bridging that gap, but it's the critical strategy for managing human talent in the 21st century.
No, I totally agree with you. And I think that CEO operated out of fear. I've seen some things lately where there are two major emotions that drive all the emotions, fear and love, and love chooses relationships first. Fear chooses winning or escaping. But rather than go down that path, I love what you've said today, Lauren, and I want to get your feeling on this. My conclusion is that because all of this training is lacking in our schools, in our families, and, we're boomers and our parents did the best they knew how. But I think as each generation as parents has come along, we've had more and more wounds, more and more trauma. And like my parents, I was raised by two loving parents, so they made all kinds of mistakes. And it's unfortunate, but they did the best they could. And But here we are now leaders, and we're running either a team or an organization. And what are your thoughts on that? We have to be realistic that if we really want our team to reach this goal of inclusiveness, to use your term, we have to invest time to help them learn these soft skills that they don't have, and the perspective. And we need to help them learn critical thinking, not what to think, but how do you peel something back so you understand the facts, and then you can come to your own conclusion and be respectful of other conclusions. But we have to invest time weekly, an hour or two, whatever it is, to train and then test. Give some training, 5 minutes of training, 10 minutes, and then kind of test it. How's that going? What do we do? Here's a scenario. How would you respond? And really help them learn. Because if we don't train them, it's like impossible. Isn't it impossible to reach that inclusive goal that you're trying to get to if they don't have the soft skills?
Yeah. One of the things that's really interesting that we just are fanatics about and do what matters. And that is the culture of solution building versus problem solving. So one of our other pillars, we talked about inclusion first, we talked about behavior-based solutions, processes, and systems. But the third is what we call solutions focused or solution building. And we actually train people in what we call inclusive conversations for not just conflict management, but strategy development. And it's really based on this idea that with traditional problem solving, we spend about 80%. You talked about fear, which I loved. I'm kind of a Yoda follower. Okay, I'm very movies oriented, as you can tell. And so, Yoda talked about, fear leads to hate, and hate leads to death, or the dark side, or what have you, right? Yeah. And so when we spend what happens with problem solving is that we spend 80% of our time trying to avoid the problem in the future rather than focusing on what our desired future is and building out a roadway to get there. And what I found, even as a chief strategy officer, what would always be interesting to me when I would get into clients who were disagreeing about everything and blaming each other for everything, is that when I focus them on the desired future, there was always 95%. I swear, and every time we've done this assessment, 95% agreement and consensus on where people want to go. They never agree on how they got lost, right? So focusing people on what is the expectation or desired future is a better starting point for much more positive, inclusive, and here you go, operationally efficient conversations. Yeah. Because we're not wasting so much time trying to avoid the dreaded future. We are spending 80% of the time building pathways to get to where we all want to go. And so we have found that this is part of that another movement called Solutions at Work movement. It really it started as a therapy here in the United States, but it has been embraced in the UK as a way of working in the office. And we train our clients on how to have these solution building conversations, because you get to the destination faster because you're not spending 80% of your time avoiding the dreaded future. Why would you spend 80% of your time avoiding something on pathways to avoid something you don't want to have to begin with, right? And so we train people on different protocols for having solution building conversations on how to ask each other questions that are solutions focused so that we can get to where we want to go faster, but also avoid that unnecessary resistance, arguments, blaming. We spend so much time on blaming. Now, this doesn't mean that solution building is problem phobic. We do acknowledge a problem, but when you start acknowledging the problem, you're already out of that problem. Why would you want to live in it? And so when you acknowledge that there's a problem, you've already moved forward. It's kind of one of those things, right? Your car stops breaking down on you right when you're getting to the right when you get to the mechanic, right? It's that same thing. Like, you're already out of the problem when you acknowledge that there is a problem, but don't spend time living in it trying to figure out why we got to that problem. Try to figure out how we get to where we actually want to go.
It's interesting. It reminds me of one of my favorite stories, and that is of Tiger Woods. He hit the golf scene, winning every tournament. Then he hit a slump, and he went and worked with his coach. And what percentage of his time do you think they spent on working on his strengths to make them stronger versus his weaknesses? What do you think?
I would hope that they wouldn't spend as much time on his weaknesses.
Exactly. And that's the surprise for a lot of leaders.
Yes.
They'll say, most of the time on the weakness. I say, no, at least the article I read, 80% of the time was on his strengths, which was long game and putting, because they knew if they did that, if they took it to the next level, he was going to crush people. But then they had to address his weaknesses, which was short game and sand traps. And the idea there was understand it, like what you're saying, and just make it so it doesn't hurt them. So when you talk about that problem, let's understand it, and then let's live in the present, and let's move to the future. What's the solution?
I think, what always strikes me about the conversations I'm having in these in podcasts that I've been doing is there's I always say there's so much more consensus on where we want to go if we would stop, living in the problem and start focusing on how to get where we want to go. But it's really, I'm always amazed that I have these conversations, but there's such a dearth of leadership in the country right now that are really solutions focused, right? And it's but there's a lot of money to be had living in the problem. And so when you talked about education, I will say, there's a lot more money to be had living in the problem, swirling it up, getting people all riled up, than there is, quite frankly, being solutions focused. We were talking, my team and I were talking about that, and we practice what we preach, right? We have a very inclusive team, small team, but an inclusive team. One of our strongest team members is, he's a white guy who voted for Trump twice. and we have these amazing conversations, right? One of my team members says we get on our status meetings, which, you talk about, 2 hours. I've seen people who leaders who parse these meetings up and say, I only have a half an hour. And I always allot 2 hours in a status meeting with my team.
Wow.
Because what I want to hear every Monday morning is, Mel, one of our consultants, he says he calls it our podcast meetings, because he said we should have this as a podcast, because I give at least a half an hour to 45 minutes for everybody to just talk about what's going on, what's happening, what is their perspective, it's not just about the business, it's about the world, what's happening. We argue, we talk about different ideas. Because I could cover what's happening this week in 30 minutes. Yeah, that's cool. And we've got a templatized way. I don't want to waste my team's time. We got to, new business, old business, blah, 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 blah. But that hour that we cover in the beginning of just this free-flowing conversation, it helps me understand the team better, where they're coming from, how they speak about certain issues, whether I hear that there's some things that I need to think about. And I can tell you, by spending that time and interest up front, saves me a lot of time on the back end, because my team feels confident about challenging me. They feel they have a forum to push back on me. I don't waste a lot of time and kind of them guessing what I'm thinking and them thinking. It just comes out in those meetings. And then we go through the week excited about getting stuff done. And everybody feels like, okay, I got heard. I got, I had 2 hours of her time. And it's not that hard. But to your point, it is hard to get out of the hydraulic of fear that I think we are in. And we need more courage. We need more courageousness coming from leadership, not just political leadership, but business leadership. If we're going to get out of this kind of, as I said, we're just in this hydraulic. And I remember a line in Star Wars where Luke Skywalker says to Yoda, asks Yoda, is the dark side stronger? And he said, no, it's not stronger, but it's easier, quicker, and more seductive.
Yeah, awesome. I love it. Lauren, I have loved this discussion. Thank you so much for coming on the show. If people want to learn more about what you're doing, where do they go?
Come to letsdoitmatters.com. And it's all about what matters in terms of talent management. And we have all of these protocols and workshops and playbooks that we use to help people manage humans better for the 21st century. So letsdoitmatters.com.
Fabulous. Thanks again. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in today. If you like the episode with Lauren, please subscribe, leave us a comment or a rating. We'd love to have you subscribe. Forward it to others. Have them subscribe. That'd be great. Please don't forget our sponsor, Habitly.com. We talked about habits on this podcast, how we have those habits, how we need to improve our habits. Go to Habitly.com. There's some great trainings there for you and your teams to get better individually, as teams, as an organization. And again, thanks for joining us. Stay tuned. We've got more great guests coming. Goodbye for now.